Kyle Balda, welcome to Tech Talk with Daniel.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today. The projects you've worked on are nothing short of awe-inspiring, and personally, I must say, some of my favorite computer games, live action, and animated movies bear your creative touch.
That's good to hear.
But before we dive into the tech aspect of your project, can you share with us the story of how you got into art?
Yeah, absolutely. I always drew a lot as a kid, and then I hadn't thought what I was going to do professionally when I was really young. Just loved to draw a lot. When I got into high school, there was a student in my art class who was a year ahead of me, who I became friends with, named Darren Davis, he was a phenomenal artist, just could draw like crazy. And so I was always trying to be as good as him and copy what he was doing. And we both had comic strips in the school newspaper and that sort of thing. So just drawing and, making up stories was something that happened kind of early on. But there wasn't a really clear idea about what am I going to do with this? Maybe I'll be a commercial artist, because I've heard that term be spoken about. I didn't know what it was, but somebody who gets paid to make their art is what I assumed it was. And so I started looking at maybe going to design schools and learning illustration and that sort of thing. And then I got really lucky because I was at one of my cousin's weddings, and she came up to me during the reception and she said, a friend of the family is an animator at Disney, and maybe you'd like to meet him and talk to him. And I said, sure, because I loved animation, but animation was probably the thing I thought the least as a career path, because back in the day, this is 1989, animation wasn't something that you could go to, it was obvious to go to school for and work as a career. It really, for me, growing up in Tucson, Arizona, it just seemed like some magic thing that happened someplace else, and then it just appeared. I had no idea how animation happens. So to even think about having the opportunity to meet an animator, somebody who does this, suddenly started to make this thing very concrete, that this is an actual job, and you can do this for a living. That would be insane. And so she put us in touch. So Dan Jupe, I think he had just finished animating Sebastian the Crab on Little Mermaid, among lots of other projects that he'd worked on. And he was just unbelievably generous with his time, and asked me to send my sketchbooks and anything that I wanted to where he lived in LA. And then he called me up after he received it and gave me all these critiques and said, you're drawing like an illustrator, you're drawing it's very you're getting into the rendering of light and shadow and all that kind of stuff. And that's not what animators do. Animators draw movement in life. And he even made a couple of sketches in my sketchbook and sent them back. And he said, if you want to do this, then you have to go to CalArts. And at the time, just to put things in perspective, I think CalArts, Ringling, and Sheridan were the only schools in North America that had a character animation program. Now there's very many, but back then it was quite limited. So I drove out to Los Angeles, and he let me crash at his place for a couple of days, and he took me to the school and showed me around. And, I couldn't have asked for a more generous mentor to kind of just say, this is the path, if this is what you want to do. And, I went to Valencia, California, which is where CalArts is. And this is right after high school. And it was too late for me to get into the program. So I got a job at a sign company. I used to make paint signs and do sign work back in Tucson to make a paycheck. So I was doing that to kind of live off of. And then at night, I was sneaking into the classes at CalArts for the character animation department to see what they were doing. And then I would go home and I would do the exercises that they were giving to the students and all this kind of stuff. And that's how I created my portfolio. So it was a very like stealthy way to, try to get into the school. But I created my portfolio and submitted it and was able to get in for the following couple of years. I think that was after the first year. So
you used what you learned at CalArts to get into CalArts?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So it was, I think, there was like a level of desperation that I was at that point, whereas like, this is it. Like, this is what I want to do. And I want to make sure that I'm able to get into the school and be able to, hopefully work in the industry as an animator. So, I mean, otherwise I'm extremely like a lawful person, but this was like like an exception that I felt I needed to make. And in the end, I think it all worked out, fortunately. And they got my tuition money. So that's fine in the end. But it was, CalArts was incredible. It was, just a huge learning experience. And also not only from the teachers that they were able to attract to the school, but also just from the other students, from all over the world, in fact, and mostly, all over the United States, but there were a few people from overseas, and just getting different perspectives, seeing different art styles. So, every day was just like a huge learning experience. And around maybe 3/4 of the way through my first year, and this is actually related to, I think, how what led you maybe to originally reach out to me was there's always visitors coming from outside in the industry to give lectures and talks, and sometimes to recruit. And there was a trio coming from ILM and LucasArts to talk about, the games company, CalArts Show. Was there talking about LucasArts games, and Eric Armstrong and Steve Williams was coming from ILM, and they were talking about this big project that's happening at ILM that's going to change the whole industry, and they couldn't say much about it. It ended up being Jurassic Park, but that they were in the middle of ramping up this film, and also Colette was there saying we're also doing lots of games. We're doing a sequel to Maniac Mansion, and there's Monkey Island happening, and all kinds of other games. And we're looking for an intern for the summer. So I was really eager to show what I'd been working on in my portfolio, and was lucky enough to get into this internship, which basically was a summer being spent on working on Day of the Tentacle, and animating in D-Paint Animator for the Amiga, so which was the state of the art in 2D computer animation at that time.
And what was your first day at LucasArts like?
Let me see. I remember I had to do a test. I had to draw Guybrush, and then I had to do a walk cycle of Guybrush in D-Paint. And that was my first experience there. But I have a feeling that if I had not done a good job, they wouldn't have accepted me for the internship. So it's because this is going back like 30 years. There was definitely a level of commitment on my part, because I think I had already moved up there for the summer and gotten a place. But after that, the first working day, the first animation that I remember working on, there might have been something earlier, but it's the shot of like punching the clown, when the clown knocks over and then pops back up. So there might have been some walk cycle tests and things like that. But it was just, I remember like every couple of days, it was Larry basically giving me a new kind of shot, a new piece of animation to do, and working very closely with Peter Chan, who was doing all the backgrounds, and getting like he also very generous with what he knows as a designer and artist. Constantly bringing me over to his desk and showing me what he was doing and his process, getting me to think, even though animation and the kind of work that he was doing was different because he wasn't designing motion, but using some of the things about composition and all that kind of stuff, and how you can think about that in terms of composing a shot.
So let me get back to the first day. At that point, it was summer 1992, right?
That sounds about right. Yeah, that sounds right.
So it was after Monkey Island 1 and Monkey Island 2 were released. So Guybrush had a walk cycle. Were you supposed to recreate Guybrush's walk cycle or recreate Guybrush using your own skills? Or
I think what they were looking for is a walk cycle that had appeal and had like, structure to it, and that looked like it was like on model for Guybrush. So even if it didn't have the same cadence as the one that's in the game, it was more just a proof of concept of like, okay, this guy could do it. He would be able to figure it out. Because it wasn't so much. You got the still
image of Guybrush, and you had to create a walk cycle out of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I do remember the file that you would get. You would see like Guybrush, like 3/4, like a profile and frontal, and then based off of that, you could start like working in the walk cycle, all with a mouse. So that was like. I remember not having a stylus then, and I got quite used to it actually. But it's a very strange way to draw after you've been drawing at a animation tablet, with your pencil and paper.
Now, around that time, you got your very first game credit, which was for the game Star Control, which was released in November 1992. What was your role on that project?
So because the games industry in the Bay Area was quite tight-knit, everybody knew a little bit everybody. And so I think it might have been Avril, who sat right next to me, who knew Paul Ritchie from Star Control and made the introduction. And he showed me like the splash screens of the different aliens and said, do you want to take a crack at like just animating some of these and just coming up with movements. And I think that's, in some cases there might've been a brief, but mostly it was just like, he just wanted to see, what I would come up with. All this from my perspective, because, I was looking forward to going back to school the next year, and it was just great experience, and I just wanted to work as much as possible. And because it was both a paid internship and Star Control was paying me some money for the animations, it was all going to contribute to, my beans and rice for the next year as a student. But the most valuable part of it obviously was to be working with professionals for the first time. But Star Control was a lot of fun also.
So which parts of Star Control did you actually work on? The splash screens, the gameplay?
Yeah, just the splash screens, like when you like encounter an alien. I probably did maybe 10 or 12 of them. And, whenever you encounter an alien and they're telling you like, we're going to attack your ship, or, we come in peace or whatever, there would be like cycling animations in them. So it was, I think I was doing all that at night on their computers after LucasArts, and sort of basically moonlighting the two different jobs.
Now, getting back to Day of the Tentacle, you worked on the iconic opening sequence, as well as some character animations, like you said.
Yeah.
Let's discuss the intro first.
Okay.
This is the storyboard of the intro.
Mm-hmm.
I have all of the screens over here. As you can see, we have these ones. Basically every screen of the opening.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that one as well.
Where did the idea for the intro come from?
I think it's definitely the backgrounds were all Peter Chan, and I believe Peter probably did these boards as well. I'm sure Larry was involved in it as well, collaborating with Peter. And so this was interesting because I had gone back after my summer internship. I'd gone back to CalArts for a semester, and they still were working on the game. And they asked if I wanted to use my Christmas break to come back and work on this. And, I was absolutely was thrilled to do it. So came back up to the Bay Area. The interesting thing is that everybody was on holiday. They closed down the studio for the Christmas holidays. So I basically lived at the studio. There was like a fold out couch that I slept on, and I used the microwave to like heat up noodles and that sort of thing. And, worked on these. So that I had a little bit of overlap before everybody left. And I remember Peter and Larry giving me the brief on this. And then they gave me all the backgrounds, which were like, the full, the completed backgrounds, again, all in D Paint. And they just said, go at it. There may have been some check-ins along the way. I don't remember all the details. I remember mainly probably just working like day and night, doing this. And, it was a blast and like a lot of fun to create all this stuff. But, and also I think just the amount of trust that they were giving me, because I was still a student at the time. And had no idea that, this would become something as memorable as it was. It's always really nice to have people, whenever they send me stuff on Twitter or whatever, just saying like, I totally remember the intro to that game. The last image that you had was really fun, because that was like, the one right after that one of the sewage. At the very bottom.
This one.
There you go. Yeah. So this was fun because this was like not character animation. It was just like trying to have like kind of toxic waste being like poured into the river. And, getting into all the VFX animation, basically, of like the swirling water and the goop kind of bubbling up and all that kind of stuff. And I believe I did that around the same time, because I think they were working on the whole front end of the game.
So that's the interesting part, because when I watched this sequence dozens of times, then I really liked the pipes themselves, and I couldn't put my finger on what was so special about them. And the thing is that, given that you're a character animator, it actually looks like a mouth vomiting if you take a look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe the brief might have been like it's belching toxic waste into the river. So you worked on this part of the intro as well as the part of the car driving. The car, yeah, and the
mansion itself. Now,
and the cow and all that.
The sequence of the car driving relies heavily on silhouettes. How did you make sure that everything was made expressive enough so that even though it was done in low FPS, low resolution silhouettes, you still understood what was going on and were able to depict the plot of the game to the players?
Well, I mean, I think it was really good that it was happening during right after my first year at CalArts, because that's when you're getting all these fundamentals of character animation, and the principles of animation. And one of the biggest principles is silhouette. So we would study lots of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton and these guys. But Chaplin is probably the king of silhouette in terms of, having come from being a stage actor, being one of the first actors on film, and his awareness of what his body looked like to camera, like the literal silhouette, and his whole philosophy of trying to get the audience to be able to read not his facial expression, because they were still using really wide angle shots, the close up wasn't used very much back then. So you had to get the whole attitude of the character from the corporal pose. And so, this was like a great exercise in doing silhouette only animation. The easy part about that was that I didn't have to render all the colors of the car and all the details and all that kind of stuff, because then it would have taken probably 4 times as long. So it was easier to get through the amount of animation that there was to do in the time that I had by keeping it silhouette. And I think in some cases there might be just like a little bit of a rim light. I really went down the rabbit hole, I remember, in animating the headlights and the sort of fake lens flares and that sort of thing, trying to work that stuff out. But that's really when you're just sitting at your desk and you have your headphones on and just kind of zoning out into the work. Yeah.
So you were in a self-imposed crunch mode?
Yes. I mean, it was, I would even hesitate to say, yeah, self-imposed, definitely. I was just really like in a flow state, probably the entire couple of weeks that I was working on this. The summer that I had worked at LucasArts before, it was such a friendly vibe, Larry and Tim and Dave, everybody, Anson, we all hung out together. We'd all go see movies together. We'd all go have dinner together. So the couple of weeks that I was there for Christmas, most of them had all gone away or with their families and that sort of thing. So my social life was like basically non-existent, and I was just there with the sequence. But I think it's like where I was at and everything. It was just perfect. It was exactly what I wanted to be doing. So.
Now, the game was supposed to come out in Christmas 1992, but management decided to give you guys 6 more months to create a talkie version. Did you use that extra time to continue working on the intro, or were you done by that point?
I was done by that point. I had gone back to school for another semester. I had started during that time when I was back at school, I had discovered 3D animation. And so that was aside from the friendships that I continued to cultivate from the folks at LucasArts, I didn't go back to work after that.
So you joined LucasArts, left your mark on one of the company's most iconic games, and quit?
It was an internship. And so I think I certainly wasn't thinking about it as me leaving my mark on their games. I was mainly just grateful to, for the first time ever, be earning a paycheck to do what I wanted to do and what I was studying to do. I had always hoped to get to work more in film. And I think that, they were very supportive of that dream that I had. And to do 3D animation. I also knew, even during my internship, that they were making Jurassic Park across the parking lot. And so that just kind of drove me crazy knowing that was happening. Like in a good way. I was just like obsessed with the experience that anybody had with 3D animation up until that point was, Terminator 2, The Abyss, what was it called? The Last Starfighter. Do you remember this movie? Like from the 80s, one of the first films to use CG. I had in high school, there was an animation festival called Spike and Mike. It was these two guys out of San Diego who would collect a bunch of short films and then travel all over the United States and show this film festival. And they showed Luxo Jr. was one of them. So I saw it at the University of Arizona movie theater. And that was the first time I had ever seen like 3D done this way, just pure character animation. And I knew that, I remember even the old Pixar logo is a square with like the circle that would be depressed into the middle of it. And I remember thinking like, I want to do that. I want to work there. So I became really, really like obsessed with 3D animation specifically. And what had happened at my second year of CalArts, which was kind of a blessing and a curse at the same time, was, Industrial Light and Magic had wrapped up Terminator 2 and The Abyss, and they needed to upgrade all their Silicon Graphics machines to do Jurassic Park. So they donated, I think it was like 5 or 6 Silicon Graphics machines to CalArts. And you had to submit a particular storyboard to show what you want to do. And they would only going to pick a couple of students to make a film on these. And I got selected for it, which was, really confidence building. But I went down this like kind of sidetrack that so many people did, at least back in the day, maybe less so now, because it's much more clear, like all the different roles that you can have working in computer graphics. But I would just be putting, marble textures on vases and things like this for weeks and weeks and weeks and not really animating, not learning how to animate. And around the end of that school year, I wasn't able to show any of my Day of the Tentacle stuff on my demo reel because that hadn't been released yet. But a company called Pacific Data Images, which later became sort of bought and absorbed into DreamWorks, they had seen my work at school. They saw my first year film, which was all 2D animation, really character animation, and my 3D work. And PDI had like a really strong character animation department in 3D. And they offered me an internship as well the following summer. So I went with that internship, and they really taught me how to do 3D animation, like a methodology. So like Rex Grignon and Eric Darnell, Tim Johnson, all worked there, and they were my mentors there, and they all became, directors at DreamWorks on Ants and, films like this. Glenn McQueen was one of my mentors there also, and then he later was the animation supervisor at Pixar. So these guys had sort of built up the character animation department there at Pacific Data Images, and then became these big important directors on various films. So this was a really great set of people to learn from. So the ironic thing about all that is at the end of that summer, they didn't have any work in character animation to offer. What was really big at that point was morphing, and the Pacific Data Images had recently, just before that, they did the Michael Jackson video, black and white, where people are dancing around and everyone's changing into a different person. And, it was just mind-blowing effects at the time. So they were getting tons and tons of morphing work. And Jurassic Park came out that summer, and they suddenly ILM has more movies than they have people to make, to do the work in visual effects. And PDI said, we totally understand if you can get a job there, you want to show them the work that you did here. And I did, and I got a job there, and basically left CalArts because it felt like the growing edge was the opportunities that were coming and working directly on these projects and these films.
So when did you start working at ILM exactly?
That was 93 fall, I think. Yeah, The Flintstones was my first job there, the Flintstones movie, followed by The Mask.
That's interesting. For some reason, you're not credited on The Flintstones on IMDb, but you worked on the project.
Oh, yeah, that could be. Every time I look at my IMDb, it's at one time I looked in it and I suddenly was credited with doing all these DreamWorks movies, which I hadn't done. And so I did some correcting on that, but yeah, I can look into that and see if I can get that fixed. But that was my first feature role. Yeah. Animation role.
And what did you do exactly on that movie?
Mostly Dino, a couple of Dino shots. There was a shot. James Strauss was my animation supervisor, and he was one of the animators on Jurassic Park. And I was very worried in the beginning of my ILM days because I felt like I was really slow, and I was trying to get the hang of, working. And even back then, I think the deadlines were longer than they are now because the industry was newer, and even those machines were slower, so you couldn't go as fast as you can now. You can't use that as an excuse anymore. But I remember I was spent maybe 4 weeks trying to animate Dino, walking into the house, jumping out of the car, coming out of the house and jumping into the car. And finally, I was really frustrated because I wasn't able to get it what I want. And so I asked James to help me, and he, in probably 20 minutes, did what I took maybe 2 or 3 weeks to do, just kind of blocking it out and showing me. So again, trial by fire, and very, very stressed back in the day because just worried, the classic like imposter syndrome, about what I had watched, all the movies that ILM had done the visual effects on since I was a kid, Star Wars and all these things. So you see the movie posters all over the hallways when you're walking around, and it was really a dream and also like terribly intimidating. But slowly getting more and more comfortable with it. And just to give you an idea how fast things were growing, I remember Rob Coleman and I started, I think, within a week of each other. And he went on to do all that great work on the newer Star Wars films. But they were hiring people so quickly because there were so many movies now with Jurassic Park's success. Everyone knew now what this technology could do. And I think there were about 30 people or so in computer graphics when I arrived, and I left probably 4 or 5 years later, and it was well over 800 people. So just, like dozens and dozens of people every month coming in. When Jumanji started, they were doing Casper, Dragonheart, and Jumanji all at the same time. And I had already achieved this level of seniority, I suppose you could call it. Oh, they didn't feel like it because I was quite young. I think I was like 22. And I was the animation supervisor in Jumanji. So that, again, another trial by fire was, to have been at the studio maybe like a year already, and to be in a place where I'm being promoted into animation supervising. Probably wasn't quite ready for it, but you get ready for it when you need to be. So.
But before Jumanji, you worked on The Mask.
The Mask, I did a couple shots in The Mask.
Which shots?
I did the shots. So the one that I probably spent the most time on, because it's the one that I remember, was when Jim Carrey falls out of the building and he splats on the ground, mm-hmm. and then he peels himself up like he's mm-hmm. all flat, and then he blows into his thumb and expands and comes back.
You did that?
I did it with the help of a lot of the technical direction team, because it's a mix of, when he's falling through the air, then he has to like become the 3D model of the flat guy. And then so I animated mm-hmm. him being pulled up. And then as soon as he starts to inflate, you're trying to match the live action plates of the real Jim back to the real Jim Carrey. And then they're like mapping Jim Carrey's face onto the 3D object. So the only thing I can really claim for the whole shot, because it's so many people involved, in one shot, is the actual, corporal movement of the flat man,
The flat man was, you projected the Jim Carrey recording on a 3D flat model, basically?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, all the textures, and especially because you can't see his face while he's lying flat on the ground until he like pulls himself up, and then you see his face, and when he does the blowing. And if memory serves, they had like all the photography of him doing the action, and then just projecting it onto the CG character until the point when he filled up the volume enough to where it started to, you could let the actual live action background plates take over. But the
live action background plates were filmed on set.
Yeah,
Jim Carrey was on set, but the scene where he was flat on the road was filmed without him on set. Right. And you merged the two scenes together.
Yeah.
Did you also work on the fall before
the fall? It's possible. I mean, I'm just thinking practically. I did, because I don't know otherwise how they would have done the stunt without, having like a trampoline or something, or like a mattress in there to catch him or something like that. So it's
because he
possible.
Jumps out of the window, and then
mm-hmm.
you see a live action filming of him. And then at some point, because he's zoomed in so much on the camera, they switch to a 3D model, because you can see really close and it's not filmed on camera. It seems like they switched to a 3D model right before.
That's right.
You see him. Okay. Yeah. That's an iconic scene. How did you ignore that?
I would have.
You moved so fast to Jumanji, but did you work on any other scenes?
Well, the mask was like kind of just a bridge for me because they were finishing it up, and they had like a separate team. Flintstones was ramping down, Jumanji was ramping up, so there was like a little bit of a gap in that. That was the shot that I got to kind of bridge it over. So it was really like an embarrassment of riches at the time, because there was, you would walk past a room and they would have dailies for Forrest Gump rolling in that room. And then over in this room, they'd have dailies for Schindler's List, rolling, like the girl in the red dress, because all the VFX that were involved in making that. It was just like amazing to have all these movies being made around you. So, you were always really happy to be working on the one that you're working on, but you also knew that you were missing something because, they were making, they were animating dragons in the other side of the building for Dragonheart and these types of things. So, and I love dragons. So it was like a total renaissance for VFX in movies.
Well, at least at the Academy Awards, when you need to congratulate someone, you can congratulate your colleagues, because most of them were from ILM. Because that year, I think The Mask was nominated, but didn't win, because Forrest Gump got the Academy Award for visual effects.
Yeah, it would be a very long list of things. For
Lieutenant Dan's legs. And superimposing Forrest in the scene with Kennedy.
Yeah.
These were the two.
So many of those types of shots.
Now we can safely move to Jumanji.
All right.
Do you know this guy?
Yep. That was me as a baby working on Jumanji.
Look at him. Super focused.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can see over here that you're working on the monkeys.
Right. Yeah, that was the monkeys in the kitchen, most likely. Yeah, that's the monkey on top of the refrigerator. And that was in, it's in Softimage, was the software back in the day.
So which scenes did you work on in Jumanji?
I did a lot of the monkey stuff. That's probably the stuff that I was able to touch mostly myself, because I was supervising we had a small team, probably about 5 or 6 animators. So most of the time I was spending just like working with those animators, doing feedbacks and critiques and things like that, or trying to like work with them to help them get their shots. I did a lot of the cycles, like the elephant walk cycles and things like that would later be like put into the Stampede scenes. There you go. Daniel Jeanette did the animation for that shot of the hero elephant crushing the car. Dale Macbeth did a lot of the choreography of the crowds of animals. And then just working to just try to make sure everything was like looking realistic, leading your eye, trying to make sure that you weren't having, like a rhinoceros cross in front of the most important action when you need to be watching the elephant crushing the car, things like this, like the overall choreography. Just trying to manage the weight and the physicality of the animation.
Now is a good time as any to ask you, fast forward to present day, why is this elephant from 1995 more realistic than elephants that were created in CGI decades later?
Oh, that's an excellent question. One thing that I think is interesting that I know about this shot is apparently, because I wasn't present on the shoot, but it was a pretty overcast day for this, and it wasn't what I think it's not what Joe Johnson maybe had wanted. I think he wanted like a really nice sunny day, New England day, but it was kind of overcast. And for me, this is just my personal opinion, I think there's a level of realism here because not everything is like saturated and kind of blown out in this way. It's everything looks slightly muted and understated because of the trying to match to the world that it's in. I think that maybe has one thing to do with it. But it's hard to know otherwise in terms of how things have changed, because I think that it just depends on the project. There's things that look really fantastic in CG. There's things that maybe don't look properly composited sometimes, or maybe the animation doesn't have the proper weight and things like that. One thing I can say that we had, like I was saying earlier, compared to present day productions, is I think we had a lot more time to do things. So, you would have maybe 3 or 4 weeks to work on one shot like this, animating this one shot and getting everything just perfect. And these days, the same shot, an animator might be expected to turn it around in half that time or even less. And so that's got to be true also for the lighting artists, the compositors, and all that. So that could certainly, be a factor in it as well.
And Jumanji is also interesting for having CG shots done in daylight, because usually in the 90s they tried to make CG shots at night, because then you wouldn't see problems with the CG itself or the lighting, or see that it's not realistic in any way. But over here, you have a daylight shot with an elephant that still looks realistic to this day. And well done. Same goes with the monkeys, and same goes with everything in this movie. And that's the thing. That's my problem with CG nowadays, is the fact that movies like you mentioned, The Abyss and Terminator 2 and The Mask and Jumanji still look great to this day, while newer movies look dated. And you mentioned that maybe the turnaround time is much shorter than they had back in the 90s. But then again, rendering is also faster nowadays. So maybe you had 3 weeks to create this shot, but probably you needed 2 weeks to render it.
Yeah, I think that, certainly the machines being faster and rendering being faster definitely helps. But the human side of it, on the other side of the artist that's manipulating all the controls in the computer and making the decisions, I think that is the time involved in doing that, and the care and the precision. I think you can rush it to a point, and then you start getting diminishing returns. But it's I think just trying to find the balance. And it's true that I remember a lot of times the lag time in like posing a character and waiting, sometime a full couple of seconds for the pose to catch up. And you would never be able to play back the animation just on the hardware. You'd always have to render something out really low res and then watch a movie to get a sense of it. And if you're looking constantly at rendering, getting up and getting a coffee, coming back, playing it, making a couple adjustments, doing it again. So then you start to maybe hopefully try to get, a couple of computers working on 2 different shots at once so that you can be using your time. Those days are over, where you can be watching your animation play back as fast as it's going to play when it's in the movie.
Were there any shots in this movie that you were sure that were ready and you rendered it, and then you noticed something and then you had to spend another week to re-render it because of some minor issue? This was something that was really a luxury back in the day, and my time at ILM was like the last time I had worked in VFX. So the VFX pipeline that you see today may look very different than this, but
from the very beginning, when you'd start working on a shot like this, you would work with a technical director who's going to be in charge of all the lighting and the compositing and all that stuff. So I would be working with my 3D file, trying to get the animal to do what it needs to do. And then around 3:00 in the afternoon, the TD would say, okay, I need your shot now because I need to start rendering every single day. And so I'd hand over whatever I had there. And then I would keep on working, for the rest of the day for tomorrow. Then what would happen is every morning the next day, we would start with dailies, and we would go into a movie theater that was built into the studio, and watch on the big screen, like a high res render of everything. So you could see your animation like with full textures and everything. The VFX supervisor, very occasionally the director of the movie would be there to give notes, give feedback. And oftentimes, because I had to work like maybe a few extra hours after 3:00 the previous day, that sometimes that work would be obsolete now or no good because of the changes that I would have to make based off of, what had been sent over. But one thing that's very, very special, and I had never experienced since being at ILM, back in the early 90s, is before the animation was even completely approved, you would even be able to see it on film. They would print it to film, put it on the projector, roll it in the movie theater. And that's an insane luxury to be able to look at your work in progress animation on film. So it was very you'd have no excuse by the time that we printed it to say, oh, I wish I could have done that if only I had more time, or I didn't see that problem, because it was just being scrutinized to such a degree, and with multiple people in the room looking for every problem they can find.
Now, the year after Jumanji, you worked on Mars Attacks. Mars Attacks is one of my favorite Tim Burton movies. Mm-hmm. What was your role on that project?
So on that project, I got to do something really special. I did all the shots of Sarah Jessica Parker with her head fused onto the Chihuahua. And and so the Chihuahua was completely CG. And I had like a little plate, like a little square with Sarah Jessica Parker's head. I think that was shot on a blue screen. That was like part of the rig so that I could see what her head was doing and then try to match the animation of the body of the dog to her. And she's talking to Pierce Brosnan, and they're having like this flirtation under these like really insane circumstances. So I spent most of my time working on those shots, and Robert Weaver was the technical director on those shots, and him and I just shared our own little office together. So we were sort of like this like little units that just got to do this one part of the show. I did a couple of Martian shots when the music starts playing and the Martian's brain starts exploding. There's a couple of them where they're like holding their heads and the ship is like moving left and right and they're tripping over themselves, and then their brains explode and they crash on the floor. I did a couple of those as well, but mostly I was working on the dog stuff.
Seems that your MO is just to work on iconic scenes, and that's it. You come in, work on an iconic scene, go to the next movie.
Very, very lucky. Yeah, I've always been very lucky with the casting.
So since you worked on the Martians themselves, then you probably know that Tim Burton wanted them to have a stop motion feel. They weren't stop motion, but they were made to look as if they were stop motion.
Right. And
how did you achieve that effect?
To a certain degree, it's a matter of like kind of building in faults, like where you would hold a pose for 2 frames rather than like letting it play through so that it would be a little bit sticky. I do remember the rigs themselves had IK, inverse kinematics. This is, like a little bit technical in terms of the rigging, but
you can talk about it.
Yeah, so every single joint had IK on it, even in the spine. So that's not how our spines work. Everything truly is forward kinematics in terms of the way that our bodies move. Inverse kinematics is really good for making something stay still, and forward kinematics is really good for like getting through, three axes of rotation. So the inverse kinematics works really well for a foot flat on the ground. But you can manipulate the puppet very easily with it because you just can grab this control and move it rather than grabbing multiple controls to rotate it. But the movement can be a little bit linear. So you have to build in multiple key poses to get your arcs, to get it to look organic. And if you don't smooth that out, and you start to add a little bit more keyframes than maybe you need, you can start to get a little bit of the jittery kind of stop motion look. It's almost not fair though, because this is like if you think about like really early Harryhausen, who I love, kind of stop motion animation. But if you look at the stuff of like Nightmare Before Christmas and James and the Giant Peach, all of Henry Selick's stuff, like I like the fluidity that they're getting in stop motion now almost makes it, where it's and building in motion blur and the post effects and things like that. They're starting to get the fluidity of their stop motion looking as fluid as computer graphics can look. But there's still that element of like the human touch that I think gives it a little bit of like a magic kind of quality that's harder to achieve in computer graphics. But you can do it that way. There's, I think as long as really at the base of it, as an animator, you're studying movement. And so the same things that would make you be able to try to animate a quadruped and look like it has weight, to make that quadruped then look like it was stop motion is, you have a manipulation over your puppet and the controls in the computer that you would know how to kind of build in the sort of noise if you like to be able to do that. I suppose these days it would be just as easy to create a plugin that could go in and sort of tweak and mess your animation curves. And, as long as you can dial things in. And the
Lego movie looks like it was done in stop motion, but it wasn't. It was fully CG.
Yeah. So, and I can't say because I didn't work on that film, like how, if that was all hand grown, stop motion look, or if they were using some algorithms to help it. I've never been against using some help from the computer, like cloth simulations and stuff like that, because I'm more interested in working in the performance and the characters. So it's in the same way that like an actor wouldn't want to worry about the way that their clothes were draping or something like that. My feeling is that an animator wants to focus on the emotion and the physicality and these sorts of things. Whereas some of the more technical details, if there's a simulator that can give you some help there, I'm all for it.
Speaking of cloth, during the production of 1996, The Frighteners, you were involved in creating the animation for the Grim Reaper's character.
Yeah.
Now, the cloth simulation in the movie was notably impressive for its time, considering the limitation of the available tools back then, and I assume they couldn't autonomously simulate cloth movement like they do nowadays. Did you animate the cloth movement manually, frame by frame?
There was some controls, like macro controls, to help if you wanted to get like a certain kind of billowing effect. But I would say that it only kind of did like some of the broad stuff in there. And if you didn't touch them at all, the people doing the simulation could still do an amazing job. It was only if you wanted to get like a certain effect, or if you wanted to animate the cloth out of the way of an object, that the simulator wouldn't be able to detect, for example. But most of that was like really the simulator doing it. Then what the animators did was the skeleton inside of it, and the gripping of the scythe and where the head was turning and all the timing and all that kind of stuff.
Back then you had the tools to create realistic cloth that moves according to the character's movements?
Mhm. Yeah, they got, so that was a special production because I think it was a bunch of people came from all over the world to New Zealand. A lot of ILM people, people from Animal Logic, from all the big studios at the time, because we had a very short period of time to work on it. I think there was only, with the bulk of the VFX were done in maybe like 6 months or something like that. So it was really crunch mode from the get-go, but it was a really concentrated amount of like highly talented people from all over the place, both on the technical side and on the creative side. So they had people literally working around the clock to try to get that stuff to work.
And after the Frighteners, you left ILM?
So actually, the chronology was after Jumanji, I worked on the Frighteners for 6 months, and then I came back to ILM for Mars Attacks. So I think it was in 1994, maybe I had traveled to Europe for the first time. And it was the first time I'd ever gone overseas. And then I just kind of became like obsessed with traveling. So anytime I had any holiday, I would go to Europe mostly, just backpacking around and staying in youth hostels and stuff like that. So as we were getting close to the end of Jumanji, I was talking to Ken Ralston, and I said, do you know of is anyone making any movies in Europe or anywhere else? And he said he knew about, this Peter Jackson project in New Zealand, and he kind of helped get me in touch with those guys. And it was a very short stint, so ILM knew I was coming back, and got to go live in New Zealand for a little while, and got to work with Peter Jackson, which was a total delight. And and so it was like a little, I wouldn't really call it like a break, because it was probably the most intense work that I'd done up until that point in terms of just like 70, 80-hour weeks and things like that. So it was grueling, but a lot of fun.
And when did you start working at Pixar?
So Pixar, mainly this came about through, so I mentioned Dale Macbeth, who did a lot of the crowds of the herds of animals in Jumanji. Dale was actually one of my teachers back at CalArts early on. And at the same time that I went to go work in the industry, he stopped being a teacher and became an animator at ILM. And, we hung out a lot and everything. So he decided to go over to Pixar. This was right after Toy Story had come out. A lot of my CalArts friends were already there and had worked on Toy Story. And I had from my Luxo Junior experience, like a big dream to work at Pixar. And Dale went over there, and about a month later, he said, they're looking for the people. They're going to do A Bug's Life. They're going to do a Toy Story sequel, and they would be interested in talking to you. So it was tricky because I was really loving what I was doing in VFX, but I couldn't not work at Pixar if I had the opportunity to. So I interviewed with them and interviewed with John Lasseter. I showed them, the stuff that I did at ILM, my CalArts films. I showed them the stuff I did at PDI during my internship there. That was actually probably a little bit more applicable because it was like 3D characters, not VFX so much, which is much more what Pixar is doing. And the interesting thing about it is that even though it was animation, what is happening at Pixar versus what's happening at ILM, or what you could say what's happening at like a fully animated feature house versus a VFX house, are completely different because the challenges in what you're trying to achieve is completely different. So, up until now, trying to make these animals in these movies seem as close as possible to real animals and to convince the audience of that, versus telling a story where you're like with A Bug's Life, it's a complete fantasy world of like talking insects and it's completely different. But one of the main things that's different is that most of the work that I had been doing at ILM was really physical based. You're trying to do natural movement. You're trying to have, like the elephant, for example, when it's crushing the car, it's not having any changes of emotion. You would never ask, where is the elephant at in its arc in the story? The elephant is like a force of nature. It's a creature. Whereas when you're working with Woody and Buzz, there are various emotional stages in their relationship and their journeys in the story. That's going to affect your choices when you're animating them. What kind of moods they're in, and in some cases it can be like, let's say Woody's getting more and more angry. That's an emotion that you wouldn't have necessarily with a creature animation. But the animator who's doing a shot or two before you also has to show Woody starting to get a little bit angry. And so you have to keep things in perspective of the other shots around you in terms of like dialing in how much emotion, how much anger to use, leaving some place for the other animator to go to and things like this. All while you're trying to make sure it looks like Woody, it moves like Woody, because Woody and Buzz move in completely different ways. So many new challenges came out of that. And that's when I started to really learn more about storytelling, because now you're working on shots where the beats that you're trying to hit in the story in your shot are related to the broader beats of the story. And that starts to, open up all these things about visual storytelling and what a director is doing on a daily basis, but you're doing it like in this little slice of the film rather than over 3 acts.
So A Bug's Life was the first project you worked on at Pixar?
Yeah, it was interesting because Toy Story, I came on to work on Toy Story 2. And at that point, Toy Story 2 was going to be direct to video. And, they hadn't greenlit it for theatrical. So the main focus at the studio was A Bug's Life. And then Bug's Life, it might have been that they needed to like get into the last 6 months of production. So they brought we had a small team on Toy Story 2 for direct to video, and we all moved over to A Bug's Life for about 6 months and did several of the shots, a little bit, maybe not so much of the like hero shots, if you like, but we did a little bit more of the supporting shots, things like that. And then in that time, Toy Story 2 they had pivoted and decided that we're going to make this theatrical release. But because it was going to be theatrical now, they wanted to kind of really up the production value, change some things about the story, make it much more like epic in scale. So that project shut down for about a month. A lot of the story things got reworked. A lot of animation got from the direct-to-video version got taken out. And then everybody in the studio just piled onto Toy Story 2. And I think we really finished the bulk of that movie probably like in 6 to 8 months, something very, very aggressive to be able to meet the release date in the time that had been lost from having reworked it. But it was the only way to have made that movie work as it did, was to go through that process.
So you came into work on Toy Story 2, but you actually worked on A Bug's Life eventually, which was released a year earlier.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, the highly acclaimed A Bug's Life was released just 2 months before DreamWorks Ants hit the theaters.
Yeah, that's right.
At what point did you become aware that DreamWorks was working on a movie that shared a very similar concept to yours?
That was pretty common knowledge. Let's see. I think I knew about that somewhere around the Mars Attacks times, and mainly because the people who mentored me at PDI were the core creative team on Ants. So it's like the animation industry was rather small back in the day, and everybody knew what everyone else was doing and working on. But I don't even mean this in like a way of like, I think there was like a press release about it as well. So Disney, Pixar certainly knew what DreamWorks was doing and vice versa. Same thing with like we would all go see at Pixar whatever movie DreamWorks was working on. When we were working on, I want to say it was Monsters, when Shrek came out.
Shrek came out, yeah.
Yeah, and we all took the afternoon off to go watch Shrek and eat pizza. So
something was really off about the 90s. Many movies came out with a very similar concept, like 2 months apart. We had Volcano and Dante's Peak. We had Deep Impact and Armageddon. We had Ants and A Bug's Life, Shrek and Monsters, Inc. Nowadays, everyone's making original movies that are based on remakes and comic books.
Yeah, it's definitely like a change of the eras, isn't it, in terms of how that happens? I wonder if some of the VFX movies that were all the same had anything to do with like, oh, now we can do lava really good, and now we can do water really, really well. Like we can make those types of movies. Because that was something that I thought was up until probably like early 2000s or something. One of the main questions that anyone would ever ask in an interview is, what can the technology do now that it couldn't do last year? And at a certain point, it hit this place where it's like, it can do anything now. It can, you can, not only can you do fur and you can do water, but you can do fur getting wet and, and fur catching on fire and like whatever you want to do, So, but there was a time where new packages would come out, or somebody would innovate something that would create a really great fluid dynamics or something like that. And then movies would come out that would accommodate that, that the tidal wave would be the star of the movie, or the hot lava would be the star of the movie.
Yeah. So asteroids, and they made Deep Impact and Armageddon.
Yeah.
And fur. Yeah. So they made, Shrek didn't have any fur.
I think there's also like
monster based.
Yeah, totally. There's maybe also like a psychological zeitgeist type thing about like what, people are afraid of. Like, I think we're going to see AI movies all over the place now. Even though there were some like really early arrivals like Her and things like that, or 2001 Space Odyssey. It probably was maybe the first AI gone wrong movie. But I think more and more you're going to see the AI as the villain, the AI as the what's at stake in terms of the world ending and that sort of thing, because it taps so strongly into what our fears are about the future. So
another interesting aspect of Pixar movies back in the late 90s was the fact that the movies back then, we had 4x3 TV screens.
Mm-hmm.
And so usually movies that were in widescreen at the cinema had to use pan and scan in order to be displayed on TV. But Pixar basically re-rendered several scenes, if not many of the scenes, to make them, instead of a wide shot, a close-up of two characters, and they replaced them in different positions so that they'll fit a TV screen. Were you part of this process?
Only in so much as I remember a little graphic that we had that showed us the two aspect ratios and trying to frame everything in the way that it needed to be. I would say probably the layout department was more involved in that, trying to design shots that could accommodate the look of both. And this is like going way back, so it's like stretching my memory. But I do remember there was occasional shots where you might have to do two versions for that shot, for the different aspect ratios. But obviously the aim was always to try to can we design a shot that can work in both? And if not, then maybe we need to bring the characters a little closer together. or something like that to avoid, the pan and scan, or to avoid having something cropped in a way that you wouldn't artistically want to do.
Well, the shots I was talking about were shots that elements were brought closer together so that they'll fit the TV screen.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that they were designed for a TV screen with things on the sides that didn't matter anything to the scene, but they were actually brought closer together.
Yeah.
The same year, you worked on Grim Fandango. What were you doing at LucasArts at the time?
Did I work on Grim Fandango? I don't think I worked on Grim Fandango.
Yes, you're credited for additional 3D modeling.
Oh, I might have done something. If I did, I definitely was aware of it happening. Mainly because I was just hanging out with those guys all the time. It's possible. Yeah, I think I might have done a little bit of modeling in between, like ILM and Pixar or something like that. But I honestly probably wouldn't have remembered that if you hadn't mentioned it. I think it was almost maybe symbolic. It was not, I did not have a very big impact on that game by a long shot.
It makes sense. It's LucasArts' first 3D adventure game. Mm-hmm. And you being a 3D artist at that point, while the people at LucasArts were just finishing working on Curse of Monkey Island, which was still 2D. So you're brought in as the big expert.
It's very possible that Tim might have asked me to do a little something. So that's funny.
So I'm glad that I took you on a trip down memory lane. And now you know that you worked on Grim Fandango.
Now I know. I remember. It's scary if I'm forgetting these things already.
The year after Grim Fandango, Toy Story 2 came out. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a well-known story about Toy Story 2 in which someone accidentally deleted 90% of the movie from Pixar servers. And technical director Galen Sussman, who worked from home, saved the day by having local copies at work due to her working remotely. So first of all, kudos to working remote.
Mm-hmm. And kudos to Galen,
20 years prior to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And do you remember this incident?
What I remember about it was because it was sort of, I remember it being, after the fact that this near horrible thing happened, but Galen saved the day, and we don't have to reanimate all of our shots. But from what I remember, there wasn't really a hiccup in animation production because of it. Because I think that the turnaround time of the rescue was pretty rapidly, if my memory serves. But certainly, I wasn't in any of the rooms of where people were discussing the potential consequences of had that gone a different way. So.
It was also around that time, after they restored all of the files from Galen's computer, they deleted the entire movie because they recreated it, like you said, and then they changed it to a theatrical release.
Theatrical, yeah. They did. I remember this, what was definitely, one thing that we preserved, the whole crossing the road sequence. We had that, but what had changed when they're wearing the cones, the pylons, and they're trying to act like the traffic cones. We had to lift all the animation and put it into a different environment because the situation of the road that they were crossing had changed, which was at the time was a big piece of work because that was like the first time that we'd ever faced that kind of problem where you want to keep the animation but have a completely different environment. So I had done a lot of that animation too, so I was very happy that that we were not losing it. But I think there was a lot of stuff. Like Jessie wasn't even a character, I don't think, in the original version. Al and Al's Toy Barn, I think all that stuff came out of the new version. But yeah, there was also, it's probably for my own sanity preservation that I don't remember the shots that we got rid of, because that's always one of the most painful things for an animator is even you're getting paid for having done the animation and all that kind of stuff. Like so much of this is like a labor of love that you want to share with people. And when your shot gets approved and then it doesn't make it into the movie for whatever reason, that's always a heartbreak. So
it's too bad there's no record of the deleted scenes you had in the original.
I wonder
movie.
if they put something like that on the original DVDs. It's possible.
I think they had deleted scenes from the final stages of the movie, but not from the original version of
the original version.
So sometimes the deleted scenes are far more interesting in terms of preservation than the final film.
Mm-hmm.
Because nowadays, when you get a DVD and you have deleted scenes, it sometimes feels like they remove these scenes from the movie just to have special features on the DVD. But when you watch a film from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you find a deleted scene, then it's actually something special.
I would say that that's probably unlikely, just because it would be a lot of money to make deleted scenes. You know what I mean? Like the process is trying to be as economical as possible, so you definitely, one thing just to kind of put in perspective is that, not just like the Illumination films, but I know this is true for like DreamWorks Pixar films. Like if you were to edit together all the storyboards, just even at that phase, the movies are like storyboarded like at least like 6 to 8 times. That's how many things we try and do and all that kind of stuff. And then even after you go that far and animate it, sometimes it can be like an audience screening, like a test screening. You show it to an audience and everybody, we're all animators. We all have very similar references. We all grew up like playing video games or like with these particular movies that we loved. But now you're showing the movie to like a mass audience who maybe don't share your animator point of view passions for particular humor and things like that. So like a joke or something that you tried just completely lands flat. Like nobody's laughing at it and it's not working at all. You're trying to make an experience for the audience with family entertainment that are going to be enjoyable for everybody. So you end up having to, kill some darlings in that sense and let go of some things. But then I think a lot of it is like, at least we have the DVD to share with the audience and the fans. I'm a crazy Lord of the Rings fan, so I love the extended versions because I want to be in Middle Earth for as long as I can, when I watch these movies. So I don't mind at all. But some people might say like, oh, that's too long, like get to the point and that sort of thing. So it's just like different tastes. But
well, my conversations with LucasArts legends like yourself are usually the length of the Lord of the Rings extended version. I had a conversation with Bill Taylor, which was 4 hours long, and with Eric Wilmander, which was 4.5 hours long.
Wow. That's pretty epic.
We're going into Lord of the Rings territory over here.
Mm.
Now, many people may not be aware that the iconic lamp in Pixar's logo originated from their first ever animated short called Luxo Jr., like you mentioned, which premiered in 1986, like you mentioned. And interestingly, the same short was later featured as the short before Toy Story 2, which is a movie you worked on.
Mm-hmm.
Did you experience a sense of completing a full circle seeing that happen?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And even with the Luxo lamp being in the Pixar logo, and eventually like they built the big statue of it on the campus. That was I got to go while I was at CalArts. I got to go to Pixar, and it was really, really small offices at this point in Point Richmond. And Pete Docter was animating like one of the Listerine commercials, if you remember, like the boxing Listerine commercials and that sort of thing. And even that was already just crazy for me, just to be like, oh, this is the computer that they animated Luxo and Tin Toy and Knick Knack on and all those shorts. So yeah, that's the kind of lore around it, you know. So it was one of the things too, because I remember when we moved from the old building to the Emeryville site, that happened while I was there. And it was, you know, it's a beautiful campus that they have now, really beautiful building. But, you know, you miss a little bit the nostalgia of being in the room where they had Toy Story dailies and, you know, and that, you know, you can never go back into those places. So I think there's something about being in those spaces and the nostalgia that you can feel, the gravity of it, that gives you kind of like a motivation or like a push, you know, when you're doing your own work, that there's like a standard that's been set that you want to hold yourself to.
After Toy Story 2, you worked on Monsters Incorporated, which is my favorite Pixar movie. And I remember back in 2001, there was a lot of talk about the number of strands of hair Sully had on his body. It was something like 2.3 million strands, and everyone was talking about Sully's hair. What was the technical challenge with Sully's hair at that point?
I mean, like across the board, every new movie had something new to it that hadn't been done before, that needed to be figured out. And so now it's easy to look at it and say like, oh, but this is really common, you know. So the you know, the R&D department and the folks working in simulation trying to get as many hairs as you're talking about without it breaking the computer, and being able, like, how much can the computer handle in the render? You don't want to render a frame that's going to take hours and hours to render, because you'll never get the whole movie rendered that way. But then, you know, getting the hair to move properly, getting it to have a softness and a sheen and a surfacing that looks appealing. All the tests that go into that. And I'm sure there was, you know, many funny failures to get to where they needed to get with it. In animation, we only saw like a hard surfaced Sully, you know, like a puppet that had, like, it didn't have fur on it.
Like a shaved Sully.
Like a shaved Sully, basically. And I think in some cases I think there was like a tool where you could see a little bit of the volume that would happen, you know. But occasionally you would have to go and fix an intersection or something like that after they put the fur on, and you'd see like, oh, now the fur is intersecting. You need to bring the hand a little bit off, or the tail or something like that. But even just things that, you know, you can totally take for granted when you look at it. I did a shot where Sully was walking and Mike was trying to stop him, and he was like holding onto his tail and trying to pull him the other way. I just had to make sure that the contact of Mike's hands and Sully's tail was proper. But, you know, the fur people had to like make sure that the contact of the fur was responding properly. And, you know, I just would have to think that at the time when this was all new, simple things like that become a challenge. Like, how are we going to do this? And then you develop the way to do it. And then the next movie comes along and you start to build up like all these things. I remember like when Nemo came out, it was all about splashing, you know, like how many times can we have the character splash, because splashes are really expensive. The VFX and the simulations and the rendering are really slow and all that kind of stuff. So every film had something. You can even look back on the original Toy Story, which I didn't work on, but my friends who worked on it said in the very early days, they didn't have inverse kinematics, this thing we were talking about earlier, that's going to keep the foot solid on the ground. So the animators had to put a keyframe for every single frame to try to make Woody's boot look like it was staying still. And that's a horrible waste of time. Like, it's just not what you want to, it's not creative. You know what I mean? You're just trying to make it look like it's supposed to look. So So when inverse kinematics comes along, then fantastic. Now that can help us, and we can focus on the performance. So yeah, I think there's always these like kind of technical barriers and obstacles that you come up against. But I found the most technically challenging thing on Monsters was animating Randall, because it was a body type that I had no experience with, this serpentine body type that he had, multiple arms and legs, and sometimes he can go on his legs, sometimes on his arms, and sometimes on his legs, and just trying to create like a really fluid kind of movement, using an IK system in his neck and trying to get the animation curves to do what you wanted to. So that was always the trickiest thing for me. And one thing that happened to me, I think at one point, which if you show that you're good at something, it's not necessarily that you like to do it. It's like, okay, you can do it. Or maybe, I think I have a lot of patience, so I can like really sit with like a technical problem for a while. But shots where like I was saying, where Mike is like trying to stop Sully and holding his tail, you have all these contact issues, and you have all these hierarchical issues. And during a certain period, I started to notice that I was getting given these shots that had these things where, you'd be switching the hierarchies of like this character's holding this character, and then no, they switch positions, or they're rolling around on the floor, dancing in a weird way. And it's like hard physicality and all this kind of stuff. So, be careful what you do a good job at, because you will get more of it for sure if you do it.
So did you work on any scenes that Sully's hugging Boo?
I don't think I did. I don't remember doing any Boo shots, actually. I think
seems very technically challenging, given that when he's hugging her, then the fur needs to move accordingly. It's not just Mike holding his tail. It's an entire body,
so much contact
moving inside the Sully's fur.
Often in those kinds of cases, you find it's like a give and take between the technical directors trying to manipulate the fur away from the collision, and then the animators helping and like reposing a little bit. So, you get people on both sides of both teams to work together to kind of solve those problems.
But were there any scenes that were removed, or storyboards that were scrapped because they seemed too technically complicated?
I don't think technically. That's definitely one thing that I think has been Pixar's MO, is to not change something because it would be too hard to do. And I think that's certainly, you think about Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs, owned Pixar for a while. But you think about the spirit with which Apple does everything that they do. It's like you can never say, oh, that can't be done, to someone like Steve Jobs. Like you just figure it out and work around it.
So Monsters Inc. is released. What do you do afterwards?
So Monsters Inc. So then going back to like this obsession I had with traveling, I really at that point wanted to see what it'd be like to live in Europe for a while. And I thought, pardon? How was it? It was good. It lasted about 20 years. So it definitely worked out. The early days was kind of funny because I wanted to take a little break from production, and I had done a fair amount of animation supervising. I was an animation director on Toy Story 2. And I really liked the mentoring part of it. And so I thought it would be fun to do some teaching. I had been doing a little bit of teaching at the Academy of Art College in San Francisco while I was working at Pixar. And I knew that I had liked it. So I remember writing emails to a bunch of different film schools in Europe. And nobody was really interested. And a lot of people later told me they thought that I was like a practical joker or something like that. Cause I was saying like, I work at Pixar, but I want to come and teach at, your school in Madrid. Or, something like that, like some really small schools. like I remember this one school in Verona that I went to teach at, and they said like, yeah, we just like laughed at the email and deleted it because we were like, who's this prankster? So surprisingly, it was actually really hard for me to land these teaching gigs in the beginning, but I did end up teaching quite a bit at the animation workshop in Denmark, and first just doing like little kind of modules, a couple of weeks long. And then I designed like a 14-week long 3D animation methodology class that I did for a while there. And I started teaching at Lego Blonde in Paris. And I had met at Annecy the year before that. I met Pierre Caffon, and Pierre at the time, now people definitely know him as, the director of the first Despicable Me movie and several after, and the voice of the Minions. So at the time, Pierre was really well known in France for his commercial work. He was doing a lot of commercials for telecommunications companies and banks and stuff like that. And he was starting a TV series called Pat and Stanley for TF1. Mm-hmm. And they were basically going to be several little tiny short films between this like dog and this hippopotamus who were roommates, really kind of like young skewing, 15 seconds to 30 seconds. I think 30 seconds was the maximum. And I had been in Denmark for about a year, and I was just enjoying traveling around. And he said, would you like to come to Paris and work on Pat and Stanley with me for a while? And I did, and it was only going to be for a few months, and that's where I ended up living for 20 years. Pierre and I started working on a lot of commercials together. We started co-directing a few commercials. We did like a Coca-Cola commercial for Passion Pictures with polar bears. If you remember the polar bear campaign from back in the day. And I was doing a lot of work with MacGuff at the time. And so MacGuff was at the time mainly like one of the bigger studios in Paris, where they would be doing like commercials, an occasional feature film. We did like Dragon Hunters was a fully animated 3D film, some visual effects mostly for French movies, a lot of stuff with Passion Pictures. And so what was interesting about the studio is that, I might be working there on a commercial with some people, and there'd be like 30 people in the room. And then you'd come back a week later and there'd be like 5 people in the room. And it was just like grow and expand depending on how much work the studio had for freelancers, because it was almost exclusively freelancers. And mm-hmm. the amount of talented people in Paris is ridiculous because of schools like Lego Blonde and Supinfocom and these really amazing schools teaching animation and 3D visual effects. So huge talent base, but not always a consistent flow of work for them. And I think it was probably in 2007 or 2008. It was right around the time where I was thinking like, this has been a good experiment of living in Europe, and maybe I'll go back to work on a big production back in the States. That's when Chris Meledandri showed up with Despicable Me. And it was a really good match because, he had a movie and he needed a studio, and the studio had a pool of talent and they needed a movie. So really good marriage that has continued to this day.
And you worked on Despicable Me as layout supervisor.
Yeah. So
what does a layout supervisor do?
Yeah, great question. So back when I was at Pixar, the head of layout, Ricky Cleland-Hura, she gave I want to say like a 12-week long masterclass on staging, layout, cinematography. And from an animator's perspective, for the most part, the layout department is the person who makes your shot. So they give you your shot, and the camera and the characters and all the assets and the set are in there. And that's a very, very small part about what layout does. But if you're an animator who doesn't know any better, then that's what they do. They give you your shot. But what ends up happening when you're an animator is like, you can't change the camera. You can't, if in layout, you'll see like a, let's say this is Woody, right? So Woody kind of slides into the room and then he turns, says something, and then he goes out. You can't, as the animator, say, well, I think I'd rather have him come from this direction and turn this way and go this way. Because in the flow of the shots, Woody needs to be going from screen right to screen left for the continuity of that. You can't decide that you want to make it a close-up instead of a wide shot because the layout department is working with editorial to design the shots, the visual storytelling and all this. So Ricky gave this masterclass, and it was basically a cinematography masterclass, and it really blew my mind about what cinematography is, because up until then I had been only thinking about performance and acting, physicality. But this was like filmmaking, that's what she was doing. And the best way I think you can put it is that if you think about in live action, like the DP, director of photography, in most cases in an animation production pipeline, the DP role is divided between the head of layout and the head of lighting, the lighting supervisor. So what the head of layout is doing is designing all the staging, all the camera angles, which lenses you're going to use, less the lights. That's when you're working more with the lighting supervisor and sometimes the art director and the director, of course. But basically you are creating the film, you're shooting the film before the animation is done. So I got really inspired by this class, and I started to read everything I could about cinematography. And I started to do, when I was teaching, I started teaching these animation master classes. And I noticed that the part on layout and staging and cinematography was getting bigger and bigger. I wanted to talk more about this. And it was really like the growing edge for me. And when Despicable Me started up, they were asking me to be animation supervisor, which makes sense because that's what most of my experience was. And I had been working with Pierre, and I had been doing all the sort of layout on some of the projects that we had been doing together. And I told Pierre, who's the director on this, I said, I would rather be the head of layout. And he totally believed that I could do that. But it was a little trickier convincing the studio just because I had never done that before. I'd never had the head of layout job, and it's an important role. But I managed to convince them that it would work, and they decided that they would take a chance on me with it. And I built a team of maybe like 6 layout artists. And so what's interesting about that is, the entire movie goes through the layout department and gets designed and built, all the architecture of the film, if you like to say it that way. And it all passes through 5 or 6 people's hands. So, you're actually having a very large impact on the film and the visual storytelling. And then a lot of times, it could even be, the chase between, Gru and Vector, the airplane chase in the first movie. Mm-hmm. You have storyboards that can help and give you like the broad actions about what main story beats take place. But the real choreography of what's happening starts in the layout department, trying to design, the movement for this. Regis Schuller did a lot of that work, and Gila Holmesy, who is the co-director on Migration now. So the you're really involved, I would say, as a filmmaker at that process. So I had a blast doing that, learned a ton, and got to work very closely with both Pierre and Chris Renaud, who directed that, and Chris Meledandri as a producer, and showing him, our process and dailies and that sort of thing. So that was a step for me that I mainly wanted to take because it was like the growing edge for me. It was where I knew that I would keep learning, and that's always been like a big drive for me.
So the layout supervisor basically takes the storyboards and creates them in the 3D world and decides the camera angles, or are camera angles controlled by someone else afterwards, after you create the layout?
Yeah, the layout department is in charge of the camera angles. So this is a little bit different depending on if you're talking about live action, if you're talking about animation, and then in animation, you have, smaller production, like co-productions. Or you have like studio films, like Illumination Films, Pixar films. At a studio film, when you hire a storyboard artist, what you're mainly looking for above everything is ideas. You're looking for fun ways to tell the story visually. You're looking for jokes, gags, usually in family entertainment. That's a big part of it. Now the drawings, if they draw amazingly well, that's great. If they draw really rough but have amazing ideas, that's also great. A storyboard artist just intrinsically has to know something about cinematography to have like a flow to the boards. But very often, like you'll get storyboards where a character will be walking from right to left, and then the next shot they're walking from left to right. And in editorial, we just flip the boards so that the continuity looks right. It's fine. Sometimes you have to give a note to the storyboard artist about a shot. Like I would rather have like a wider shot here or something like that if the director has something in mind for it. But the storyboard artists, while they may have an influence on the final cinematography, that's not what they're trying to do. They're not trying to design the shots themselves. In live action, especially if it's for like an ad agency with like a commercial, that might be the case. If it's a co-production where you have multiple investors over several different studios, the approval process becomes much more difficult because you have so many people to get approval from that you write the script. The script gets approved. Now it's really hard to change the script. Then you storyboard the script. The storyboards get edited. Now it's really hard to change the storyboard because you have to get everybody to agree. So then when the layout department works on that kind of project, they are basically very often replicating what the storyboard is, because you can't surprise the producers who've invested the money. If you're working on a studio film, it's very different. It's way more fluid. You'll be working halfway through the film and the script isn't even finished, or it's getting reworked. You re-storyboard something, you rework the sequence. So it's much more organic. And it actually, I think you're trying to find ways, not even like intentionally, they just kind of evolve this way, that replicate the process of a live action movie. Because in a live action movie, the script's written. Maybe you have storyboards, maybe you don't, for a particular sequence. Everyone's on set, they're shooting it. The actors are trying something. And now that you're doing it with real actors and the words are coming out, maybe you caught this in rehearsals, hopefully, but sometimes even on the set, something's just not working, or the actor says, I'm stumbling on this line. This line doesn't feel like what my character was. Do I even need to say this line? Can't I just do the action? Isn't my emotion going to be able to get it across? And the director's like, absolutely perfect. In some cases, the writer has to write something, figure something else out, have pages for the next day for the shoot. So it's a very living animal, that's happening. You're trying to plan as much as possible, of course, but it's like these things can kind of come up, and having the flexibility to respond to them can help the result of the picture better. So storyboarding is probably the closest thing to actually shooting the movie, where you're trying things, you're editing them. You don't have the actor's voice yet, so you get people in the studio to do their best impressions of the characters. No one else is going to see it but the filmmakers. So you just want to get a sense of the rhythm and the tempo and that sort of thing of how it plays. And then the layout comes in. Very often layout will give you multiple choices for different shots, like a beauty establishing shot or something. And then the editor and the director are working together to decide which one they want to use. So it's a really big part of the filmmaking process in that respect. But, a lot of these roles, like even if you look at television animation, like on The Simpsons, the storyboard artist in some cases is even doing key poses for the animation. It's like that's how locked down the storyboards are. So they really can mean different things for different production types. Yeah.
Well, it's a good thing that your director is also the voice artist for the Minions. So you don't have to do an impression of the Minions. He is the Minions.
Yeah, that was incredibly valuable for lots of reasons. And in some cases, even on the animation level, you wish you had like a little word or something because you come up with some gesture but you don't have the dialogue to support it. And Pierre would do it, and 45 minutes later, it's in your shot file and you can keep animating. So that's not a luxury you get with when you have to book, the A-list talent months in advance before you can record them for the next thing. So
the Lorax marked your directorial debut as a co-director.
Mm.
Now, when there are two directors working on a movie, it raises the question of who holds the decision-making authority. Can you elaborate on how the vision for the movie was decided and what compromises had to be made in this particular case?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, the Lorax was quite simple because as a co-director, I was working under Chris Renaud. And so he was definitely the principal first director on the film. A lot of what I did on that project, because I was just coming off of layout, is I worked more closely with the layout artists, worked in animation with him as well, but because of the experience that I had in animation, and did a lot of on that particular project, did a lot of mirroring of him, and part of that too was also to gain experience as it was, looking more and more like I was going to be moving on to directing roles in the future at Illumination. So in many cases, it just helps because the director on an animation film can't always be everywhere they need to be to answer all the questions, to do all the reviews, because it's a less linear process than live action. You will go from a meeting where you're looking at designs for in production design for some sets or a prop or a vehicle or a character, and then the next meeting you might have might be final lighting on a shot. Where this particular part of the film is at the end of the pipeline and almost completed. So you're constantly having to adjust rather than being in a really clear pre-production and then being on set and then being in editorial and then being in post. Those things certainly do. There's a lot of overlap there as well in live action, but in animation, it's kind of all happening simultaneously. The flip side of that is that you have near endless control to turn and tweak knobs and change things in animation that you don't have in live action. Once you shoot it, it's you want to make sure you got it before you move on. In animation, it's so much more forgiving that you can do it again, a month later if you need to, reposition the camera or whatever. But I would say that when I worked on the other films with Pierre, the two films that we directed together, what was great about that is that we both had the places that we liked working in. And while there was some overlap, I loved being in editorial. I loved being with the layout artist. I loved being with the storyboard artist. And then he really wanted to be in animation. And be working on the performances. So he definitely would be looking at layouts and being layout with me, or, looking at the storyboards that we edited, and he would give, some ideas and say can we do this or that differently? But, to be fair, I would say that, Pierre was the senior director on Minions and Despicable Me 3. And then I was the senior director on Rise of Gru. So it's, we do, you find a lot of ways for, you to work together so that you're trying not to be in the same room together as often as possible so that you can just keep everybody moving forward. But there are certainly some places where you have to make the decisions together and decide on things, especially when you're coming into places like story meetings, when you're working with the producer and the writer to discuss what's going to happen in Act 3, or what's going to be the major turn of this sequence or this major character arc and things like that. But even like, there were some of the actors that I would direct and some of the actors that Pierre would direct, and just finding ways to kind of divide things up.
So the key to this collaboration is basically trust.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, admiration and respect of what the other can bring to it. I think like Pierre has like these like amazing ideas and comes up with like really very unique and interesting ideas for sequences and things like that. And I think I have a much like more zoomed out view of like the film as a whole, and he's like bringing in these like really memorable moments. So it's like, working from the macro and the micro, and then sometimes that will flip into the other direction. I always would get really involved in the Act 3 action, where you're trying to basically like previsit a lot of the action, figure a lot of that kind of stuff out, while he would be really involved in doing, making sure the animation was being delivered and to like a level of quality that everyone would become used to.
Now, being in a managerial role, like a director, presents a challenge, since you're no longer directly involved in the hands-on aspects of the animation. Instead, you guide others on what to animate. Did you find yourself missing the actual process of animating?
I think for me, I still do love animation, and occasionally I'll do some stuff personally. But I think the challenges that I was entering into as a director were already so fulfilling that I didn't have even like the time to miss it in a lot of ways, So I think the main thing that helps is you can certainly have a respect for what the animators have to do and what their jobs are, and like the challenges that they're facing. So you're trying to find a way to communicate with them to save them from going down a blind alley or a place where they're going to have to turn everything around and do something totally different. It happens. It does still happen. And sometimes it happens because when you do step back and put the whole movie together, there's a story reason that makes you have to change something earlier on. But I think I actually find the best results you get is, first of all, you try to understand all the individuals, what they're strong at, what they want to do, where they want to grow into, so that you are able to set them up to succeed, but also try to make sure they're not getting bored, because everybody, I think, does best when they're learning something and they're challenged. So you have to pay a lot of attention to the casting, and you try to like say, I think, so-and-so would be great for this shot, or like with storyboard artists, like I want to give this person a comedic sequence, this person an action sequence, because they're really good at it. But checking in, to make sure that they're not getting burnt out on doing only that one thing. Because then when you put somebody where they're really good, you want them to bring their ideas forward, and then you sort of become the custodian of the story as the director. Like, if the story will reject that idea, or if it will plus it, if it's going to ameliorate things. And if it's an idea that is better than the one that you had, that's all the better. This is like the most concrete example of this maybe is that if you're working with an actor, you maybe have an idea in your head from having read the script and having lived with this for months about how Gru would say that line. All right. But you have to forget how that sounds in your head, because if you try forcing Steve Carell to do that, you're going to be missing out on how amazing it can be when he does it like his way, because as you're the custodian for the film, he's the custodian for the character. So he becomes Gru in that moment, and he's brilliant. So you let him go off the page if he ad-libs or comes up with like a different idea or a different joke, or whatever the case might be there, and that gives you something that you would never have gotten if you just kept on trying to get him to do it the way you heard it in your head. That's going to just be, it's going to be a lost opportunity.
The Lorax was produced at the same time as Despicable Me too. Was that the reason why you didn't take part in the production of that movie?
Right. Chris Renaud also directed on Despicable Me 2, and he was overlapping end of Lorax with the beginning of that. And then I was doing work on the Minions while Despicable Me 2 was in production. So I was working on the earlier side of that in storyboarding and pre-production.
So you were working on the Minions as early as 2012?
Yeah, I think I had a little bit of a break. I might have like maybe 2 months off between Lorax and Minions. I did a little bit of marketing stuff for Despicable Me 2 because I did a lot of marketing stuff for the first Despicable Me. But yeah, then I went onto Minions, and I think we spent like at least 6 months of storyboarding before we started even like building anything new for that movie.
And where did the idea to create a spin-off for Despicable Me come from?
For Minions, I believe that was Brian Lynch. Well, Brian Lynch wrote it, and I believe it was a lot of his pitch. I think that's definitely true for Rise of Gru. But I think, it was first I would say the main idea was the resonance that the Minions had with the audience, and the confidence that, that the audience would want a Minions film, that they would show up and appreciate it, which we were very, very happy that worked. But, just trying to find an origin story about who are these guys? So like, where did they come from? And I think Scarlet Overkill was really early on one of the main ideas for the characters, but I think her goal was different. I remember at one point, I think she had like a vendetta against the Beatles because they were sending a message of peace and love, and she was a villain who was against those things. And then we had pivoted from that. And, so like really like in the early days of the movies, you try a lot of different things and start to see what sort of shape starts to take place before this idea of her wanting to be the Queen of England and steal the crown and recruiting the Minions. But I think one of the main pitches that Brian had early on was sort of like a road trip movie, and really centering around VillainCon, that there would be a convention for villains, and to like explore more of the universe of villains that Despicable Me started to hint at, and to use the Minions as like a vehicle for the exploration of that world.
My house is filled with Minions. I have this one is from Universal Studios. It's the Minion Mayhem ride. Mm-hmm. If you remember, in Universal Studios Hollywood, there was the T2 ride since 96 until 2013 or 2012 when it was shut down, and they started working on the Minion Mayhem ride. And I was in the US around that time.
I didn't know that replaced T2.
Yeah, it replaced T2. In Hollywood, it replaced T2. Every other location, it replaced something else. I think in Singapore, it replaced Back to the Future. But in Hollywood, it replaced the T2 one. Wow. And I came to the US in 2013. So T2 was already shut down. And they weren't ready with Minions Mayhem, right? So I was in between rides.
What did you do? Which ride did you go on?
But at least I got a cup. I got an official cup. And my daughters also have
Minion.
tons of Minions action figures around the house, which I usually step on during the day. Moving on to Minions: The Rise of Gru. Now, origin stories are fun to tackle, but in the end, there's always the fear that the origin story may conflict with the continuity of the series or may cause the character to lose some of their mystery. Did you fear that might happen with The Rise of Gru?
No, I think mainly because I remember watching one of the early test screenings of the first Minions film. And when they see young Gru at the end of the movie and young Gru and the Minions make eye contact, the audience, the reaction, it sent chills down my back because we had been working so hard to try to find that moment and make that moment. But the satisfaction that people had, because I think they had been looking for Gru the whole movie. So that really, I think you're trying to make these films that connect, right, with the audience. So when you spend enough time with them and listening to them, watching the films that you're making, and also when you have the opportunities to respond before the film's over and you're having some preview screenings and things like that, then coming off of that movie, for my part, I never doubted that the relationship between young Gru and the Minions and how they formed, who they became together, that wouldn't be like an amazing story, that wouldn't be I knew that would be a story, and I think all of us did, that this would be a story that people would really connect to, that there's a lot there you could work with. And Brian had talked about Kung Fu really early on. And, we're always looking for new situations to put the Minions in. And this comes up a lot in terms of how to handle a Minions film, is because you want to respect who they are and how people have gotten to know them, but you don't want to stay locked into the same gags constantly. You want to find new places to take them. And one of the ways that helped that evolve was to start to pull out unique characters out of this big mix, right? So, in the first Despicable Me movies, the Minions were a mass character, right? One big character of 500 different characters. But now Kevin, Stuart, and Bob start to emerge. Otto starts to emerge, even Mel in Despicable Me 3 starting to emerge as a unique character. And then how do they fit in, or how can you start to explore more emotional arcs with these characters who are kind of silly and dumb in a lot of ways. And, you find that a lot with, how much heart Bob has, or how much responsibility Kevin puts on himself, and what a trickster Stuart is, and how he's constantly undermining everyone else's plans. And, he's really the adolescent of the group. But thinking about Kung Fu, thinking about the era, because we ended the first Minions film at the end of the 60s, and we wanted to have Rise of Gru take place in the 70s. And Kung Fu films were huge in the 70s. They still are, but that was the big explosion. Bruce Lee, you think about Bruce Lee in San Francisco and Chinatown, and the story just started to find all of its place in this. So I think one of the main ways that we had approached it was thinking almost of it as a romantic comedy between Gru and the Minions, where it's Minions meet boy, Minions lose boy, Minions get boy back, that kind of thing. But you're really with the Minions and Gru, so there's a little bit of a balance there. And I do personally think that the Minions are at their best when they're with Gru and they can play off of Gru. Because in a lot of ways, Gru is such a curmudgeon. He's so snarky and cynical and all these kinds of qualities, where the minions are just very joyful, even though they're trying to be bad. They just end up laughing all the time and messing up and falling over each other. So there's like a really strong juxtaposition and contrast between how these two characters can be together.
With Minions, you entered Star Wars territory, given that Minions: The Rise of Gru is a sequel to Minions, and you're also still in the Despicable Me series, which the Minions is a prequel to.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. Sequel to Minions.
Are they going to continue running in parallel?
That's an excellent question. This will be the first time where I will be in the position of the audience for the future films. So I will be discovering with everyone else.
Now, the Rise of Gru was delayed several times due to the pandemic. It was originally supposed to be released on July 3rd, 2020.
That's right, yeah.
And then it was pushed back to July 2021 before it was delayed once again to July 1st, 2022. 2 years after its original release. Now, it's interesting as the pandemic gave us a glimpse into a world where all movie releases suddenly have more time to refine, change, re-edit, or even redo entire movies. Were you tempted to change anything, given that you had an extra year or extra 2 years to work on the movie?
No, I mean, partially because we had locked picture. All the teams had, moved on to the other movies that they were working. They were working on Super Mario Brothers, and those films needed the human resources, the talent working on them. So I mean, it's sort of like we couldn't have done it if we had wanted to, but I mean, I suppose you always can find a way to. But the more important thing, I think, is that we had really worked to get the film to a point to where we were ready, that we felt like it was ready. It was doing what we wanted to do. We had accomplished what we wanted to do. We were very happy with the results. And then it was mainly more a question of just wanting to share it and having to have the patience to wait for a movie-going culture to be back in place that we can show it to the world in the way that we had intended to on the big screen. So that was the hardest part, was just the waiting. But I'm so glad that we did, rather than having gone to streaming or anything else, because it's just we hadn't conceived it for that screen. We wanted it really to be in the movies, and when people started showing up for it and appreciating it, it made it all worth it for us to have waited that long. But yeah, heartbreaking every time.
It's great that you had the confidence to see the movie as a whole without touching it for 2 years or a year and a half. And because lesser artists would have probably watched it and thought it wasn't as good, or just like artists do when they see their past work and they think, I could have done this better and it changed that.
Yeah. I think there's a time and a place like that where the chemistry of everybody who comes together to work on it is creating what it is, and that works with the voice actors, that works with the composer, like Heitor is doing the music, like all the animators, everybody's working on it. So it's a performance, if you like, that happens. And it's not something, I think, like, you start to do an injustice to it if you start to go back in and mess with it too much. If you have worked so hard to get it to a place where it's working the way you want it to start pulling on things can unravel things, because you start to do a little change here, then you have to get the music to be re-recorded or recomposed, because now the scene is longer or it's not doing what it used to do. The music doesn't work with it. So there's a knock-on effect, that where it starts to unravel a lot of things. I always like the Claire Dodson, who is the editor on all the films that I've worked on as a director. She would always say, like, we're never finished. The movies are just taken away from us. And I think that's just a part of it that you have to concede to, because you're not even the same person you were when you started making this film. So you would already start to have made it differently by the time it's over. And I think in the same way as like a writer, like you don't want to spend your entire life writing one book. You write a book, you learn from the experience, then you write your next one, and you continue to grow through the works that you're making. So.
Now, as someone who worked on visual effects and computer animation for quite some time, I wanted to ask your opinion regarding the Uncanny Valley. Now, computer animation and visual effects have gone a long way since the 90s, and we're still seeing visual effects in which humans don't look like humans. So what do you think is missing from visual effects nowadays to make believable humans?
Yeah, I think the humans have always been the hardest thing, because what you're up against is, thousands and thousands of years, if not more, much more, of evolution of sapiens looking at other people, and the little micro movements of an eyelid, how that can communicate something, how a very subtle raised eyebrow can communicate anger or fear or something like that, like how much you can communicate with somebody without saying anything, just from what's happening on their face. So we're experts of what human movement looks like. Animals also, to a certain degree, but it's more forgiving, because we have a herd of elk that come by the property here from time to time, and I can't imagine any emotion that they're having on their face, like if they're happy or sad, or it all looks the same to me. So, but I can detect, especially from an animator's perspective, like the cadence of the way that they walk when they're trotting or galloping or walking and all these types of things. But when it comes to humans, we spend so much time looking at somebody's face, and especially we spend all that time looking at the eyes. So, if I was to cover my eyes and talk most of this interview this way, at a certain point, people would just even stop hearing what I had to say, because they can't connect anymore. And I even think it's interesting how when you see on the news and they try to protect somebody's identity, often they'll just be like a little black band, or like that part will be pixelated, and how little you have to do to change somebody's face, and to hide their face. So if the eyes aren't given and this is true for animation as well as motion capture or anything, if the eyes are not given the attention to work for all the life, then you are going to like have a hard time making the audience connect with that, have empathy for that character. Lip sync is interesting, because really good lip sync it becomes invisible. It's you really only notice lip sync if it's off, because then there's something pulling your attention, because something's weird right there. But if something's weird right here, then there's like a glass wall. You can't touch, you can't connect with what it is you're seeing. So I think, there's, I suppose, definitely virtues to doing photorealistic human animation. I think it'll never compare to having a human actor doing it, because they can't, like, you're trying to use all this technology to do something that you can't get a elephant to walk on a car exactly the way that you want to, but you can work with an actor to do that, So there's reasons to do this in other ways. there's reasons to do a CG tiger in the room rather than a real tiger that is unpredictable and you have no idea how it's going to behave with the actors. You know what I mean? So there's other reasons in that sense to control these things. But certainly for the story to de-age a character or to be able to, use the technology to do that. I haven't seen the latest Indiana Jones film yet. So I can't speak to how that was done, but to be able to, connect the story in those moments. One thing I'll say is because I don't remember the primary experience that I had of, this is a spoiler for the first season, was the second season of Mandalorian when Luke Skywalker showed up. My experience of that was not Uncanny Valley. It was like, oh my God, it's Luke Skywalker. It was the emotional connection to the character. If I was to go back and scrutinize it, I don't know, maybe I could find something to say, but in that moment it won me over, So I think it definitely can work. I think it's a matter of how well it's used and how much attention is put into it. But I think there's different cases for why it would be appropriate or needed, I suppose.
And why do you think we scrutinize CG more than we did puppets back then? Because back in the 80s, when you had Yoda as a puppet, he didn't say, my suspension of disbelief isn't working in this case, since I noticed that it's a puppet and it has limited movement.
Yeah.
But nowadays, even though CG is very realistic and believable, we still scrutinize it more than we did back then. Why do you think that is?
I think, it's a very philosophical question, and I think it's the ones that we're trying to answer to be able to push the technology forward. But so I'm by no means saying this is absolutely what it is. I think these are just my own kind of trying to feel through the question. I think on one hand, Yoda, especially the first time we saw him, not a human, so you can have a little bit of license about how this creature would move. Arguably state-of-the-art puppeteering at the time that came out. Just a beautiful puppet in itself. The voicing, incredible. Everybody always really connects with that. I do actually remember Yoda's eyes being quite soulful in that puppet in a lot of ways. But now you can look at it and be like, oh, I can really see where it's a puppet. But I think maybe expectations were at scale back then compared to now, that was pushing it so hard that people were like, this is incredible, that this is the best of this I've ever seen. But I think creatures are always, especially fantasy or science fiction creatures, are always going to give you more license than a human. But maybe compared to, I think, what is it? There was a quote that I had heard from Werner Herzog talking about how they would be cowards if they used CG for Grogu. In the first one or something like that, to be courageous, to stay with the practical in camera, and, my wife always makes fun of me because whenever we watch Mandalorian, Yoda just brings out the giggles in me just because he just Baby Yoda just makes me so happy. Cause he's so damn cute. But I don't think, doing it CG would have been necessarily better. It's already moving you. It's already bringing emotion out. So I think maybe our expectations have gotten a lot higher. But you have good examples and you have bad examples. I think, Gollum in Lord of the Rings is incredible. I never found myself, maybe there might be a shot or two if I really, and I can't think any off the top of my head that I would find some fault with it or something, but mostly, I'm just getting hooked on the movie, hooked on the character and what's happening, getting rooted in what's happening. It's often, that's one thing too, that I've, used to talk a lot about whenever I would teach is like, if one of the best ways to learn is not always by watching something good, because usually if something's good, you just get hooked on it and you get emotionally invested in it and you're entertained by it. And at the end of it, you're like, oh yeah, I was supposed to be like looking at the camera angles and stuff like that. If something's really bad and not working, then it's like, it starts to become obvious where they didn't understand the rules enough to break them, or they didn't even understand the rules at all, and they're just like making blatant mistakes in the filmmaking, and sometimes like being able to articulate back why that wasn't working can really be growthful for yourself as a creator to get over that. But usually when something's working really well, you have to watch it multiple times to study it, turn down the sound, try to not get like emotionally rooted into the story, and study it as like reverse engineer it, or even take notes on how it was made or what they're doing, what the beats are, what the shots are. And then you can start to see like a thinking maybe that they had behind it. But that's the magic of when things work really well, is that all that stuff just becomes invisible and you just get into it.
Or maybe people are just more forgiving when it comes to puppets, because Mandalorian 2023, they don't talk about Grogu being a puppet. They talk about Luke Skywalker and the Uncanny Valley.
Right. Yeah, I think that the standards are really high, because especially, I grew up with Ray Harryhausen, so Jason and the Argonauts and Clash of the Titans, and or even like, it was before my time, but one of the first films that I saw early on was Harryhausen's King Kong, and you can see the fingerprints in the fur of him, like how he moved the creature, but you're not thinking that when you're watching that for the first time and you hadn't seen anything like that before. You're just thinking like, my God, there's a gorilla in the Empire State Building. So yeah, like we are all, and it's right, it's correct that we all get an eye for things. We all get more used to things, and the standards become higher, so that we're constantly pushing it. And maybe now we're going to have to be telling stories and Vision Pro virtual reality space from now on, and to be able to like go into the even more immersive experience, of watching the story.
Before we wrap up our conversation, my 9-year-old daughter wanted to know who was responsible for creating the design of the minions and what your initial reaction was upon seeing their design.
So the very original Minions had a radically different design. So Sergio Paulis he originally pitched the story, and he made a storybook. And I think you can see some of this stuff on YouTube or definitely online. Some of these images of the original Minions looked much more like all different shapes and sizes of human kind of henchmen with axes, and in a lot of ways, you can imagine that, first of all, it would be very, very expensive to have to create all those individual characters. And there was a bit of a missed opportunity with that in terms of like the comedy juxtaposition you can get with Gru, because Gru is already kind of emerging as that kind of character, that the Minions sort of looked like early on. But I would say that Eric Guillon was the major visionary for the look of the Minions. He has a beautiful art book out now where you can see a lot of the sort of research that he did and the different generations of the Minions and different things that were tried before they ended up with their little workers' overall suits. And the monox and binox, we call them, the two, one eyes and two eyes. And a lot of it is just like the bright color, the joyful color of them. The fact that they're cute and a little bit grotesque at the same time. But there's like another paradox there. But the Minions are really all about paradox, because it's like the whole drive they have to be evil, when in fact they only like fail up and do good things, and their idea about being bad is like knocking each other over. They don't really have it in them to do something truly truly diabolical, but they want to so badly. So I think, Eric, through his exploration of that and trying to understand, working with Pierre Caffan and Chris Renaud in terms of like what the story is, and Chris Meledandri to like shape like what we're trying to achieve here as the movie. I think he was largely responsible for the design.
And one last question for me. What are your plans for the near future?
So I've been developing various things, and I have been working on some stuff that I'm not at the liberty to talk about yet, but different stories, different mediums, and shortly moving back to Los Angeles next month, just to be closer to the industry, and hoping that everything gets back online soon for everybody's sake, and that we're all making movies again soon.
Well, thank you so much, Kyle, for taking the time to join me for this conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure.
It's been a blast.
For me too. Thanks so much.